All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. In this lecture, we are going to continue our exploration of multiculturalism as a particular period of American literature that gets started in the 1970s and goes through the 80s and 90s. And in this lecture, we just talked about Gloria Anzaldúa and the La Conciencia de la Numistisa. I think I said in that lecture I wanted to talk about that alongside Leslie Marmon Silko's Lullaby, but I did change my mind on that because I went a little long in that one. So in this lecture, I want to talk about two pieces of fiction, which are Leslie Marmon Silko's Lullaby and Amy Tan's Two Kinds, an excerpt from her novel The Joy Luck Club. And I want to think about the ways in which they exhibit some of the characteristics of multiculturalism we had talked about, as well as some of the ways in which they are similar to and different from Anzaldúa's vision in La Conciencia de la Numistisa, or Ishmael Reed's sort of vision of multiculturalism from last week in the Neo-Hoodoo Manifesto. So those were two manifestos. They were nonfiction, though hybrid in genre with elements of poetry, and in Anzaldúa's case, autobiography. Here we have two more conventional pieces of literature. They're both short stories, we've been reading short stories all semester. And I want to consider them together. So first, I want to start with Leslie Marmon Silko. She was born in 1948 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and raised on the Laguna Pueblo Reservation. Her own heritage was Laguna and Plains Indian and Mexican and Anglo-American, and she's talked about this mixed heritage, but she mainly identified with the Laguna Pueblo culture, and that's the culture that tends to be reflected in her writing. And this idea of writing from the position and on the behalf of a culture that is marginalized by the dominant culture is a key idea in multiculturalism. And though we saw some of that in earlier parts of the course, especially in the mid-century, it wasn't nearly as overt. Especially sometimes you would see in the way that, for instance, Tennessee Williams used certain codings to that kind of encoded a queer subcultural sensibility in his work, but didn't write on behalf of queer culture, in the way that Gloria Anzaldúa makes a statement that queer culture is essential to her work. So this kind of overt signaling of cultural affinity is part of multiculturalism. Leslie Marmon Silko was educated at the University of New Mexico and came to prominence as a novelist, poet, and short story writer in the 70s during what was called, somewhat problematically, the Native American Renaissance in American literature. And this is a wave, a generation, or really two generations of Native American writers starting in the late 1960s who emerge and create a kind of new birth for Native American literature. Now, Native American literature, even in the English language, had existed deep into the 19th century. The first Native American novel was published in the 1850s by a writer named John Rollin Ridge, and there's later writers like Zikala Sa in the late 19th century. So the problem with Native American Renaissance is it might suggest that Native American literature is somehow a new thing in the 1960s, which isn't the case. But there is, as part, I think, of this broader multicultural movement, this efflorescence of Native American literature that you see in writers like Silko and like Louise Erdrich, who we will also be reading in this course, though a bit later. So one of the things I want to note about Silko's work, and she, like Anzaldúa, wrote in mixed and many genres. She wrote poetry, nonfiction, fiction, and the story Lullaby comes from a volume of hers called Storyteller. And if you ever even see this book as a physical object at the library or the bookstore, you'll see that it's this kind of elongated book because it's in that format, because it contains photographs, it contains photography, it contains drawings, I don't know if it contains drawings, I haven't looked at it in a while. It contains fiction, nonfiction, poetry. So like Anzaldúa's Borderlands, Storyteller, which I think was published in 1981, is a mixed media and a mixed genre and a hybrid genre presentation. And this hybridity of genres is going to be something we run into more and more as we get to the late 20th and then into the 21st century. The sense that the boundaries between and among fiction fiction and nonfiction are breaking down. We saw that in Didion's New Journalism, the boundaries among poetry and nonfiction, as we see in several writers. So this inability to distinguish genres, which is clearly a part of that postmodern breaking down of all boundaries. There's a little note that I want to point out in the Norton's introduction to Silko's life, where they talk about her novel, Ceremony, and what it's not so much something they said, it's something they quote her as saying. She says, "The chanting or telling of ancient stories to effect certain cures or protect from illness and harm has always been part of the Pueblo's curing ceremonies." And then, end quote, and the editors pick up. "So this story of a family represents an attempt, quote, to search for a ceremony to deal with despair. The despair that has led to, quote, the suicide, the alcoholism, and the violence which occur in so many Indian communities today," end quote. And this idea of, well, two things. There's two ideas here. That storytelling has the power to heal the community. It's a kind of ritual, spiritual practice. And that this is traditional, to the Laguna Pueblo, and she's reflecting this. So we've seen Reed make claims about the traditional merits of African diaspora culture. We've seen Ansel make claims about the particular merits of La Raza Cosmica, the mestizaje of Mexican Americans, of Chicana people. And now we see Silko make claims about the traditions of the Laguna Pueblo. And I think I point this out because postmodernism was supposed to call into question all grand narratives. And it did. But one of the things that happens is once you clear the ground of the grand narratives on which Western, white, dominant American culture had been based, you leave room for new traditions to reassert themselves. And so you're not skeptical of all narratives. You're skeptical of narratives insofar as they are dominant, normative, oppressive. And that's why those dominant narratives of European American society had, as Ansel said, and as Reed said, to be called into question. But in their place, the traditions of marginalized communities can come to the fore because they are so they claim, not oppressive. Well, Ansel didn't claim that. Ansel said there's oppressive features in all, oppressive aspects of all communities. And I think Silko represents some of that as well, but that they are at least less oppressive. They have more potential. And there's a kind of justice, a kind of redress, a kind of reparation in the reassertion of these formerly marginalized and oppressed narratives. So there's a kind of, you might say, conservatism that comes in the wake of postmodernism, that it destroys certain dominant cultural ideas and leaves room for other cultural ideas, multicultural ideas, to emerge. So let's look at a few passages from Silko's Lullaby. I don't actually have a lot to say about this story because it's very short. And so there's just a couple things I want to point out. The story overall, it's told in the restricted or limited third person, so we're occupying the mind of one central character, who's this elderly woman named Aya, this elderly Laguna Pueblo woman. And she is waiting for her husband, who's gone to the bar, and she's thinking about her life, and she's thinking about the sorrows of her life, that this marriage that she's been in for 40 years has in many ways not been satisfactory to her, that her eldest son died it seems like in the Vietnam War, that her two younger children were taken away from her by the state, and that she's sort of living on this reservation that sort of at the mercy of the US government. And so it's a very kind of depressing portrait of the ways in which this woman's life was circumscribed by the ways in which she was marginalized as a Native American and as a woman. And we see that, and so I think both of those are important, because as I said, we have that claim by Ansel that almost all cultures in the New World, whether they are indigenous or Mexican or United States based or African derived, almost all seem to have elements of gender and sexual domination. Almost all seem to have sexism and homophobia within them. And I think that Silko points out this problem that her heroine has as a woman. And we see that in the passage where she's thinking about her husband. It was then that she would look at his face and his hands scarred by ropes and the barbed wire of all those years, and she would think, this man is a stranger. For 40 years she had smiled at him and cooked his food, but he remained a stranger. And so this is a problem we've seen come up from the beginning of the course in texts like A Streetcar Named Desire or Sylvia Plath's Daddy, and we saw it in Ansel Dua, and now we see it again, and we saw it in Adrienne Rich, this idea of the problem of a culture where a woman is expected to be a wife, and that's kind of her identity, and she doesn't have much identity outside that, and here we see the lack of satisfaction that comes from that. So there's that aspect, this quality even within the Native American community of her alienation as a woman. But I think even more harrowing than that, as the story portrays, is the way the state takes her children away. So it seems like they've come to sort of almost like on a health inspection that they suspect they might have tuberculosis because they were with their grandmother who had tuberculosis. And then it looks like there's a general, like a social worker comes in and decides the children aren't living in good conditions and seems to take them away for good, which is, I think, a reference to the Indian boarding school movement that happened in the late 19th and early 20th century, where the children of many Native American communities were it wasn't exactly mandated by law, but there was a variety of like coercive measures used to take the children of Native American communities away, educate them in boarding schools in which they weren't permitted to speak Native American languages, they couldn't wear Native American dress, and they were essentially indoctrinated into a European American way of life. And I think that's in the background of these events. That's not exactly what's happening here, because I think that had pretty much ended by the later 20th century, at least in the form it had taken in the earlier 20th century, but it's what's being alluded to. And so Aya watched the government car just disappear down the road, and she knew they were already being weaned from these lava hills and from this sky. The last time they came was in early June, and Ella stared at her the way the men in the bar were now staring. Aya did not try to pick her up. She smiled at her instead and spoke cheerfully to Danny. When he tried to answer her, he could not seem to remember, and he spoke English words with the Navajo. So the idea is here that they've been weaned, which is a word used generally in the context of training infants to go from being breastfed to being bottle fed. And so it's a very, if you follow that metaphor, it's a very poignant image of they're literally taking her children almost from her nurturing breast, essentially. That the cold, false mother of the state has come in to remove her children, and they're removing their culture, which includes a certain relationship with the land, being weaned from the hills, and a relationship with their language. So and this shows, I think, what I was talking about earlier, which was the importance of family in multicultural literature, that you see. And Ansel Dua's Ansel Dua, Ansel Dua seems to be quite anti-family in a lot of ways. That she's sort of in favor of this almost prophetic, visionary, individualism of this new mestiza who will embody this new consciousness and bring this new truth, and breaking out of family structures which are patriarchal and homophobic and heteronormative seems to be a big part of what Ansel Dua is about. And I think in this story by Silko and in the other story, Two Kinds by Amy Tan, we see something a little bit different. We see that there's a sense that as long as the families of a certain community or culture are marginalized or threatened as part of that community and culture, it's hard to give up on them, even when you can see the flaws in the family structure, in the marriage relation. And I think we see that here. And we see it too at the end of the story, because how does the story end? In this very sad ending where it appears that she and her husband Chato are simply going to freeze to death. They're sort of too far from home. He's very drunk. They have a very desperate life. They live on this welfare money, and their children are gone, and he spends the welfare, he sort of drinks the welfare money every month, and they are basically resigned to death. And as her husband dies, she sings to him. This is where the story gets its title, this lullaby. She could not remember if she had ever sung it to her children, so these traditions are being attenuated, but she knew that her grandmother had sung it and her mother had sung it. So this matrilineal Native American tradition comes up at the end of the story, and that is given the last word in the story. The earth is your mother, she holds you. The sky is your father, he protects you. Sleep, sleep. Rainbow is your sister, she loves you. The winds are your brothers, they sing to you. Sleep, sleep. We are together always, we are together always. There was never a time when this was not so. And so this vision, this enfolding, encompassing vision of natural connection, of the entire world as your family, all of nature as your family. This vision reasserts itself in this most desperate moment when these two characters have essentially been killed by the alienation they've experienced as a result of this more holistic, comprehensive culture being marginalized. So that is Lullaby by Leslie Marmon Silko. I just want to point that out. It's ambivalent relation to family, but also its sorrow at the disruption of the Native American family and its reassertion, even at its doom-laden conclusion, of this Native American spiritual vision of kind of universal family that has been disrupted by the encroachment of the Western way of life. And in Amy Tan, we see something, again, similar but a little bit different. So I want to talk about Amy Tan's story. So Amy Tan was born in 1952 to Chinese immigrant parents in San Francisco, and was then educated at Berkeley. And the story we read, Two Kinds, I think was a little bit autobiographical in the way it talked about the main character's mother, and the way that the main character, the narrator's mother, had experienced the loss of some of her children in a prior marriage, in the political turmoil and violence that was happening in China in the middle of the 20th century. The defeat of the U.S.-backed nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek and the triumph of Chairman Mao and the Communist Revolution and the founding of the People's Republic of China. And then there was the Great Leap Forward, and then later in the 60s, the Cultural Revolution, helmed by Mao, that occasioned a great deal of violence and chaos. But I think that it was during that 1950s, 1940s moment in the after... Well, so even before all that, there was the Japanese occupation during World War II, and then there was a kind of almost civil war in China that led to the defeat of the U.S.-backed nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek, and then the coming into power of the communists, and then some of the violence and oppression and chaos caused by the communist regime. So it was a century of turmoil in China. I'm not a historian, by the way, and I'm not a historian of China, so I apologize if I got any details wrong there, but I think that's the story in its broad outline. And Amy Tan's mother, in particular, I think her father had a more stable position working with some Christian ministries, but her mother had experienced, I think, a prior arranged marriage and then gave birth to two children who I think she lost in some of the violence around the events I was just describing. And then she was raised in San Francisco and educated at Berkeley, and she did a couple jobs. I think it said she was a medical writer, but eventually she starts writing short stories, and she puts these short stories into her first novel, which is a sort of a novel in the form of multiple short stories called The Joy Luck Club, published in 1989. And this becomes a huge bestseller. It's one of the best-selling books of the day. It's a popular novel, which is a collection of stories about the relationships between younger Chinese American women and their mothers. And their mothers had been raised in China, and so it's about not so much a culture clash between Chinese Americans and the Western way of life, as so much as how that conflict plays itself out in families. And we saw a little bit of this similar, because immigrant writing, the writing of immigrant communities, is a major tradition in American literature. So I think the last time we saw this was in Philip Roth's work, and Philip Roth, from the Jewish American perspective, writes a lot about the same themes. And so this trend of and so there was immigrant literature before the multicultural period, but the way in which it's written about can be different. So The Joy Luck Club, huge bestseller in 1989, made into a popular film in the early 90s by Wayne Wang. And I wrote a pair of tickets here because I've taught that story from the Joy Luck Club as well, but the one in our anthology is Two Kinds, so that's what I meant. So Two Kinds is a chapter in the Joy Luck Club, and she was one of the writers who brought Chinese American literature to the forefront, along with Maxine Hong Kingston, whom I've already mentioned in these lectures and whom we'll be reading later in the semester with her book from the 1970s, The Woman Warrior. And both Tan and Kingston, have been criticized for giving a kind of overly negative portrayal of Chinese or Chinese American culture, one that kind of panders to a white audience. And this is part of that conflict we saw when we talked about Ishmael Reed and some of his skepticism about feminism. So this is kind of a perennial conflict. If you're writing on behalf of a culture that's been oppressed or marginalized, what are your responsibilities? Do you need to portray it in a positive light to resist that marginalization? That was the problem Philip Roth faced. That's why his story was so controversial in the Jewish community, because they said, you're portraying our community in a bad light. And Amy Tan was charged with this. Maxine Hong Kingston was charged with this. I think Toni Morrison, to a certain extent, was charged with this. So if you're a member of any community that has been oppressed or marginalized, and you're a fiction writer and you do not portray it in a wholly positive light, you may be criticized for being complicit with that community's oppression. So that's my basic background I want to give you on Amy Tan. She emerged as a novelist, as the Norton editors say, just when American readers were focusing on multiculturalism, mother-daughter relations, and contrasts between old country and new world generations. So her themes kind of fit right in. The other thing I want to say in general, before we get into some of the specifics of the story, is I want to talk a little bit about genre. So this is a realist short story. So was the last thing we read, Lullaby by Leslie Marmon Silko. This is a realist short story. It's a story of everyday life written in rather accessible language. But Amy Tan is also a popular novelist. So we talked about this with genre fiction, the division between, elite novelists and popular novelists. I would say the Joy Luck Club is kind of halfway between. In fact, sometimes it works like this are called middle brow. Like there was the high brow, the low brow, and the middle brow. And so the middle brow, I don't really subscribe to these terms necessarily, but the middle brow has certain literary merits, but also addresses a popular audience. The point I want to make, though, is that this is a popular novel. It was a huge bestseller. I read it back in the mid-90s. That was the last time I read it, I fear, from cover to cover, though I've taught Two Kinds and a pair of tickets, the two most anthologized stories from it, a number of times. I think the fact that it's a popular novel has a lot to do with some of the ways in which it's different from, for instance, what Ansel Dua or what Ishmael Reed have been saying. And what do I mean by that? So what's the basic story? So we have this narrator who is recollecting her past when she was raised in Chinatown in San Francisco by a mother who was reared and grew up in and was an adult in and had seems like a struggle in her life in China. And the conflict between them is that her mother has very high expectations for her. The idea is that in America, because there's so much opportunity, you, as a child of an immigrant, are expected to excel and you're expected to achieve things. And it's interesting because this is not portrayed in the story as a particularly Chinese characteristic. I think for the perfectly good reason that it's a theme in so much writing of writers who are the children of immigrants. And Philip Roth writes in his novel Portnoy's Complaint very much in this vein. You just see this throughout the literature of immigration. And, if I may for a second, my mother is an immigrant as well. And so I related to some of this as well. And so what I think is really being addressed here is an aspect of American culture that her mother is conveying. It's not specific to Chinese culture, and that's why you see it in other immigrant communities. And the aspect is this American dream idea. You can be anything you want to be in America, is the image that America itself promotes, particularly, overseas. And so the way the story begins is my mother believed you could be anything you wanted to be in America. You could open a restaurant, you could work for the government and get good retirement, you could buy a house with almost no money down, you could become rich, you could become instantly famous. And then it goes down. America was where all my mother's hopes lay. She had come here in 1949 after losing everything in China. And so the story is essentially about this conflict between a mother who had lost everything in China, who had come to America believing in this American dream, and who was incredibly demanding upon her daughter that she become a prodigy, this prodigious genius, this child genius. And it almost didn't matter in what field of endeavor, but she had to become a genius at something. And so it becomes a story about her trying to become a musical prodigy, a piano player. And it's a very funny story. So Amy Tan's a very funny writer. And so she's being taught by this music teacher who doesn't actually hear very well, so he doesn't get that she's not learning it, and she's kind of defiantly not learning it because she resists this identity being imposed on her. And then it comes time at the climax of the story for her recital, and she just sort of bombs the recital because she didn't really learn how to play the piano, and her mother is mortified. But then her mother tries to make her keep learning the piano, and then they have this fight, and she kind of horrifyingly says to her mother, I wish that I had died just like the children you lost in China. It's like that. I think we've all been in a situation like that when you're in a fight with a loved one and the fight goes so badly that you just say the most hurtful thing you can think of. And so that's what she says, and her mother just leaves the room and they never speak of it again. And then the story flashes forward to her adulthood, the narrator's adulthood, and her mother gives her the piano and says, and she says, oh, I don't know how to, I never learned how to play it. And she says, well, that's because you didn't try hard enough. And when they're adults, that statement takes on a different resonance, and it becomes almost a tribute she pays to her, that, she respects her intelligence and she's going to give her this gift. And then the story ends poignantly after the mother's death and the narrator sort of learning to play the piano again. And sort of wanting to do it almost as a tribute to her mother. And so a couple passages I want to look at. One is this idea of identity, of personal identity, where she's looking in the mirror and she says, she sees herself and she sort of hates what she sees, such a sad, ugly girl. And then I saw what seemed to be the prodigy side of me, because I had never seen that face before. I looked at my reflection, blinking so I could see more clearly. The girl staring back at me was angry, powerful. This girl and I were the same. I had new thoughts, willful thoughts, or rather thoughts filled with lots of won'ts. I won't let her change me, I promised myself. I won't be what I'm not. And so here the story strikes that note we hear in Ansel Dua, of this individual bearing a new consciousness who will be free from all the bad parts of all prior traditions. This kind of strong, nascent young woman who's coming into her own. But the story, interestingly, ultimately doesn't validate all of that. And I think that's what separates it from calls to this kind of exceptionality of the new consciousness that you see in Ansel Dua. So we have the horrible passage where she says to her mother, "I wish I'd never been born. I wish I were dead like them." But the thing that her mother says is, this is where the story's title comes from, only two kinds of daughters, those who are obedient and those who follow their own mind. And so the mother posits this dichotomy. You can only be obedient strictly, or you can go your own way. And I think the story resolves by finding the middle ground. The story resolves with her not defying her mother, but finding a rapprochement with her mother, where they each acknowledged that they were sort of both half right. That her mother, her mother sort of gently says, "Oh, you never tried hard enough," but it's more lighthearted, and she gives her the piano as if to say, "I'm not pressuring you anymore, but I believe in you and I still have faith in you." And that she sees that her mother, while in certain ways deluded about the American dream, was paying a kind of tribute to her by believing in her. And her mother kind of relaxes her grip and isn't trying to impose so much by the time she's older. And so there comes to be this rapprochement that lets the family still exist as a family unit. It's not broken open by this new consciousness. And the way the story ends is with her playing the piano and finding these two pieces, pleading child and perfectly contented, and seeing that they were the two halves of the same song. That this conflict that structured her family life nevertheless made up what her family life was. And so the story rejects, and this is what I meant to say about this being a popular novel. So Ansel Dua is writing a manifesto, and Ansel Dua kind of goes into academia, and she's publishing works with very small presses and then with academic presses. Ishmael Reed is in the same situation. These are kind of avant-garde writers and thinkers. And I think in a certain way they're addressing an audience that's a necessarily small audience that they're summoning into the avant-garde. And so they're saying, you can be this, you can be this new thing. That's what I was trying to say about last week. I don't think I was very articulate about it, but I was trying to say that Reed's, wholesale dismissal of monotheism, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, forget all of that. I was trying to say that's a pretty, especially when he was writing, is a pretty avant-garde, I want to say fringe position a little bit. And similarly with some of the things that Ansel Dua was saying about forging this entirely new consciousness that will just completely sort of replace the things that had come before it. And they are writing to an audience of budding artists, of budding academics. Tan is writing to a much broader audience and therefore is making a somewhat more modest point, where she openly rejects. The point of the story is to reject the exceptionality of the avant-garde artist with a new consciousness. The point of the story is to find a way for that individual, that child looking in the mirror with thoughts of her own, to find a way back to the community. To find a way back to the community she comes from. And this finally returns us to the conversation we were having last week about different writing styles. Reed and Ansel Dua write in a very demanding style. If you don't speak all the languages Ansel Dua uses, then you've failed to meet the kind of ethical challenge of this new consciousness. And if you can't handle her hybridity of essay and poetry and manifesto and memoir, then you're sort of not keeping up. And as I said, I defended that last week. I think I said that in a way that's a democratic way to write. It shakes you out of your complacency and demands you rise to the occasion as an informed co-creator of the public space. But by the same token, there is a certain exclusionary element to it. And Tan writes for a broad audience in much more transparent language, and finds her way to a much more modest point that an audience, all of whom do not plan to become avant-garde, exceptional artists, can respond to. And so the story rejects that exceptionality in the name of a kind of accommodation with the family and the culture. So I think this shows, I think one of my purposes is to say that multiculturalism, I think what I said when I started lecturing on it is multiculturalism isn't so much a set of ideas as a set of problems. And what I meant by that, and I think the same is true of postmodernism, what I mean is, by a set of problems is it's a set of themes to which there are no easy answers, a set of questions to which there are no ready replies. And so different writers take on different ways of responding to these themes, to these questions. And I think you can see in Ansel Dua and Reed and Silko and Tan very different ways of thinking about it. So that is my lecture on Silko and on Tan. We will turn finally to perhaps the most celebrated writer of this period in American literature, who is Toni Morrison, in our next lecture. Thanks very much and have a great day.